In our new series of videos, we would like to discuss the constitutional law of India. So, in that connection, we would like to trace the very origin and development of constitutional administration in India. So, we'll touch the historical background of the development of constitutional law of India. As we know from history that the East India Company was ruling over India till 1858, and in 1857 there was the Sepoy mutiny or rebellion against the British Crown. So the British Crown taken over the very administration of British India territories under the newly enacted Act, and that was Government of India Act 1858. So, under this Act, the British Crown exercised its power by the Secretary of India with assisted by a council of 15 members known as Council of India, and subsequently in 1861 the British Parliament enacted the Indian Council Act of 1861, and this Indian Council Act 1861 added some non-official members into the Governor General's Executive Council in administration of the British India territories, and subsequently the British Parliament enacted Indian Council Act 1892, and under this act Provincial Legislative Councils were formed, and subsequently Indian Council Act 1909 was enacted by the British Parliament for administration of the British India territories, and the very Act, Indian Councils Act 1909, for the first time introduced an element of election, and besides that also this act was notorious for introducing separate representation to Muslim. So this separate representation of the Muslim community thus showed the very seeds of separatism in India, and subsequently again the British Parliament enacted the Government of India Act 1919, and under this act diarchy was introduced in the provinces. Also, there was devolution of powers and creation of bicameral legislature, and for the central federal legislature a council of state which was known as the upper house, and a legislative assembly which was known as the lower house. These were introduced under this act. So, regarding the Diarchy Act, or which is otherwise known as dual government, so regarding that also, the very subjects were divided as into transferred and reserved subjects also. At the same time, there was devolution of power to the provinces. So, that devolution was a kind of delegation from the center. Certain powers and the very Indian legislature was made representative in character by introducing the very bicameral legislature, council of state, also the legislative assembly, and subsequently the most important act that was enacted by the British Parliament was Government of India Act 1935. So this act introduced communal representation, and the very act was very notorious for that it provided separate representation not only for the Muslims but also for the Sikhs, the Europeans, Indian Christians, and Anglo Indians, thus it created a serious hurdle in the way of building of national unity, which the makers of the future constitution found it almost difficult to overcome. And besides that, it also provided provincial autonomy. So, provincial autonomy to the provinces under this act was given effect since April 1937, and also there was the introduction of diarchy at center. So, as per this provision, the diarchy, the executive authority of the center was vested in the Governor General on behalf of the Crown, whose functions were divided into two groups: the administration of defense, external affairs, and regarding tribal areas was to be made by the Governor General in his discretion with the help of the councillors appointed by him, and secondly, with regard to matters other than above reserved subjects, the Governor General was to act on the advice of a council of ministers. So, also, another element that was introduced under this act was distribution of legislative power. So, regarding distribution of legislative powers in between the center and provinces, the threefold divisions was made in the act. There was a federal list over which the federal legislature had exclusive powers of legislation, and this list included matters such as external affairs, currency and coinage, naval, military, and air forces, also census. And the second list, that is the provincial list, and which consists the matters over which the provincial legislature has exclusive jurisdiction, such as police, provincial public service, education, etc. And besides these two above list, under distribution of legislative power, there was a concurrent list of matters over which both the federal and the provincial legislature had competence, such as criminal law and procedure, civil procedure, marriage and divorce, arbitration, etc. So, also, there was an element of residuary power, and regarding that residuary power, the very residuary power of legislation in the act was very unique, as it was not vested in either of the central or provincial legislature, but the Governor General was empowered to authorize either the federal or the provincial legislature to enact a law with respect to any matter which was not enumerated in the legislative list. So, now we'll go to the last most important enactment, that was Indian Independence Act 1947, which led the independence of India. So, under the act, dominion status, which was a long demand by the Indian freedom fighters, was given under the Indian Independence Act 1947. So, dominion status, it was promised in 1929, but it was not confirmed by the Government of India Act 1935. And by giving dominion status to India, there was abolition of the sovereignty and responsibility of the British Parliament. So the crown was no longer as a source of law. So the very sovereignty of the dominion legislatures were given. So also the very abolition of the sovereignty of British crown and British parliament was abolished. So the very dominion status which had been denied to India by the Government of India Act 1935, finally considered by the Indian Independence Act 1947. So these are the constitutional developments regarding constitutional administration of India by the Britishers after the crown taken over the direct administration of British India territories in 1858, after defeating the Sepoy Mutiny or the armed rebellion of 1857. So, in our upcoming video, we'll discuss the very aspects of the Constituent Assembly and how Constituent Assembly was formed and how it worked in regards to enact a new constitution for India.